The Gothic immediately summons to mind a distinct set of aesthetic features: ruined medieval structures, gloomy shadows lurking about, rolling fog on the moors, the distant howl of some nocturnal animal, flickering illumination, and a sense of the past immensely interjecting itself to doom the present. And it was perhaps F.W. Murnau's 1922 masterpiece of German expressionism, Nosferatu, that most enduringly captured the sense of the Gothic on film. So much so that much in the way of horror films as a genre are basically commentaries, extensions, and reimaginings of those shadows reaching out to us, the uncanny valley of Nosferatu's monstrous appearance, or the impending sense of inescapable dread. From Ravenloft to Castlevania, Dracula to Frankenstein, The Cure to Kyla Mikla, the Gothic has flourished as an art genre and as a lifestyle. But the Gothic is a surprisingly recent aesthetic development. It's hardly older than the United States of America in many respects. But let's explore the philosophical foundations of the Gothic and what is often considered its first true expression, the aptly named second edition, The Castle of Otranto, a Gothic story. A tale, however, that's almost considered unreadable by most today. Make sure to subscribe for weekly explorations and topics of esoteric history, and if you'd like to support the work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon and some of the merch that we have for sale on the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get the lay of the land, make sure to check out my study guide, which is a directed study of the vast and interesting different domains in the study of Western esotericism. And if you're interested in getting your hands on actual historical books on the occult and the mystical, check out my bookstore, Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment. But now, let's turn to the historical and philosophical foundations of the Gothic and of Goth. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Something like tales of horror have very probably existed long before civilization and will probably endure long after civilization's memory, serving probably as communal wisdom about the dangers lurking beyond the hearth and the tribe. But elements we recognize as horror appear as early in civilization as the descent of Inanna or the descent of Ishtar to the underworld. There we find her threatening to unleash hordes of the living dead to feast upon the living if she's not allowed entrance into the kingdom of the dead of Erishkakal and Nergal. Of course, once she's there, she's stripped of all of her finery and hung lifeless on a nail. Egyptian literature also reveals tales of lonely ghosts bereft of the comforts of their tombs in the afterlife, and the Israelite literature contains a chilling account of the Baalat Ov, the necromantrix at Endor summoning the prophet Samuel from the dead, only to provide news of doom for King Saul. All the classical elements of the ghost story appear in a recounting by Pliny the Younger, a classic haunting house story, where the Stoic philosopher Athenodorus is beset by a ghost bound in chains, shaking them in the night. Found to have been unjustly murdered, the victim is eventually given a proper burial by the Stoic philosopher, and the haunting of the Athenian house comes to an end. The European Middle Ages and early modern period were nothing if not a demon-haunted world, abounding in ghosts and demons and trolls and goblins and changelings. And I've actually covered a wide range of these kinds of tales of ghosts and demons and monsters in other episodes, so make sure to check out some of those in the links below. But despite the persistent myth of a disenchanted modernity, modernity isn't by no means disenchanted, that has been thoroughly put to bed, supernatural horror, both real and artistic, continues to fascinate us. But the Gothic represents a very specific, very modern form of horror. The ghosts and demons of the Middle Ages, despite their sometimes frightful appearance, are practically cartoonish. They're almost always brightly colored, vibrantly clear. They're even commonplace. Medieval ghosts also appear just kind of jolly, smiling in a form, despite the fact that they're otherwise skeletal in nature. The Gothic is a distinct shift, a post Enlightenment delight in the dark, the irrational, the emotional, the ruined, and the mysterious. But to understand the Gothic, especially as it emerges fully formed in literature in the 1764 Castle of Otranto, we have to explore not just the shift in aesthetics, but also a shift in the very philosophy of subjectivity and consciousness itself. While pre-modern philosophies of mind had largely dealt with the structure and functioning of the mind or soul and its various faculties, it would really be John Locke's 1689-1690 An Essay Concerning Human Understanding that would dramatically shift philosophy of mind away from pure analyses of structure and function to questions of consciousness, to questions of personality, to questions of personal identity, and moreover to questions of subjectivity, paving the way for the radical phenomenological, existential, and even cognitive developments of more recent centuries. But it would be Locke for whom consciousness was the necessary and sufficient condition for personal identity, and his analysis hinged on just what consciousness was and just what consciousness was conscious of. This shift not just toward the subject, but to the nature and moreover the experience of subjectivity itself represented a sea change, a dramatic shift in all the Western philosophy of mind. Now, of course, this shift had already basically happened in literature. This is more to the point of Hegel and the whole Owl of Minerva always appearing too late. The characters of something like Hamlet and Shakespeare being now widely recognized as the first character defined precisely by their subjectivity in all of its proto-existentialist glory and turmoil. But hang on to Shakespeare. Hang on to Shakespeare. He's going to matter way more in the story as we go. But with that Lockean shift towards consciousness, towards subjectivity, there was an explosion of British philosophical interest in the very experience of consciousness, especially as it was indexed towards sensation. Recall that while Locke's entire first chapters on his essay were actually an assault on the Cartesian idea of innate ideas that were all the rage on the planets. Thus, if what's to be in the mind must first be in the senses, sort of radical empiricism, studying sensation as process and experience must be foundational for any philosophy of mind. And in the generation that followed, just such studies blossomed, often starting with the most basic sensations, especially pleasure and pain. Entire structures of human sensation, consciousness, subjectivity, even morality, looking at you, Bentham, were erected around these basic pushes and pulls of the nerves of the human body and their experience and sensation. Of those studies that emerge, particularly romantic interest in the experience of beauty, an experience often linked to human reproduction via sexuality, with a consensus of that being the most fundamental of all pleasures emerged. But in those explorations of sensation associated with beauty, something strange, even unsettling, became clear. There was something like a sensation of beauty associated with pleasure, but a kind of dark twin of beauty. Beauty in a way, but born out of pain, out of anguish. Describing the vast mountains of the Alps, Joseph Addison would contend that their beauty was a kind of agreeable kind of horror. That dark sensation was denoted as the sublime, and it would receive its most sustained early analysis in Edmund Burke's 1756 A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, somehow a completely British named book. Burke's analysis, of course, informed by previous philosophers and artists, hinged on the mutually exclusive origins of the sensation of beauty and of the sublime. Beauty emerges from pleasure. It's linked with self-preservation via sexuality. Beauty is light, delicate, smoothly curving, relatively small, cute, sweet, fragrant, sonorous, graceful, elegant, symmetrical, soft, lush in color, with gradual variation and refinement. You know, Downton Abbey, Bridgerton vibes. Not Not so the sublime. Unlike beauty born from pleasure, the sensation of the sublime was born from the tensing of our nerves within our bodies, our eyes clenched, our imaginations crushed under some horrible immensity. The sublime was born from pain. For Burke, the passion associated with the sublime emerges from our contact with the overwhelming power of nature in pure astonishment with some degree of horror, as he has it. In the sensation of the sublime, our mind is so overawed that only the sublime fills our mind. It throttles our reason, it drives us as a taskmaster, it robs us of conscious thought and activity. Burke then continues a blow-by-blow proto-phenomenological analysis of the characteristics of the sublime, creating a veritable checklist of the fundamental ingredients in the creation of the lighter Gothic aesthetic. And as such, here is a rare case where philosophy at some level truly does inform art. The Gothic at some level is the Burkian sublime willfully distilled into literature, art, music, and film. And thus, the sublime is founded upon natural terror, uncontrolled fear born from the tremendous power which inspires just that passion. The vastness of a mountain, the blackness of a night, the titanic swelling of a sea in tumult, a storm relentlessly bearing down with hail and rain and lightning. And yet, this horrible magnitude is also met with terrible obscurity. The sublime is just beyond our full ability to grasp it. It hides in the dark and in the shadows and the gloomy pomp of the Miltonian hell, the inner darkness of forgotten temples or caverns deep within the earth. Thus, the sublime has its mirth in darkness, gloom, confusion, mania, and obscurity. Despite that obscurity, the sublime is terrible in its power and threatens to annihilate not only us and our consciousness, but life itself. It's the horrible power of unpredictable vengeance from the gods, the tremendous violence of the divine, as Job is chastised toward the end of that book. Power with nothing of reason, nothing of care, no mercy, and no restraint. And yet the sublime can also be sensed in the vastness of privation, of emptiness, of vacuity, and of silence, solitary, vast nothingness. It is that vastness, especially the vastness of infinity, the vastness perhaps of eternal cosmic gulf, the streaming eternities of space and time in which all human proportion becomes meaningless, laughable even. You getting those Lovecraft vibes yet? Barring such infinities, vast structures, including human structures, can also inspire the sublime. For Burke, magnificence wrought in stone, from the megaliths of the especially primeval world to mansions, castles, and churches, all inspire a sense of grandeur, magnificence of some other thing than us, something larger than our individual smallness and relative unimportance. The sense of the sublime is especially fired in witnessing such grand structures destroyed, witnessing their ruins, that even such vast human architecture ultimately stands no chance against decay, time, and the historical violence of the convulsions of revolution. This is truly history as horror in the mind of the human being. Light can also be sublime, but not the soft life of illumination associated with beauty, rather the random flickering of light and dark, the violent appearance of lightning. The sublime is as always as hypnotic as it is dazzling. Orally, the sonic landscape of the sublime is one of intense variation, vast echoes in the deep, thunder, artillery, raging storms, but also the nocturnal sounds of creatures, especially nocturnal predators, such as the owl, the bat, and the wolf, all inspire some sense of dread in us waiting for the dawn. The temporality of the sublime is also staccato. It is sudden, unexpected, unpredictable, intermittent. The sublime is the jump scare rendered into existential reality. Even the smell of the sublime may be drawn from ashes, the stench of blood, the sensation of insects crawling about our skin, the taste of bitter wormwood, the smell of rotting food and flesh. All in all, the Burkian sublime is the dark, dread sister of beauty, born from pain and astonished horror. Now, I know what all of y'all out there are saying, but I take pleasure in a lot of that stuff. That's just the kind of stuff in horror films. That's pleasurable to me. It's not born of any kind of pain. That's because most of us have never actually experienced the sublime, because civilization is mostly about insulating us from nature and thus the principal efficient cause of the sublime as an experience. So, what are we experiencing when we experience this sort of lovely, though perverse pleasure in horror? We're experiencing what Bert actually calls delight. This is the emotional arousal akin to the sublime, but stripped of any real power to actually harm us. This pseudo-sublime is terror defanged. It's horror curated. A painting of a mountain, a monster on film, a graveyard visit, but with none of the real grief of actually mourning a loved one. This is the no-touch haunted house. It's the sublime as a safe word. And yet, there is delight in it, we have to be honest. There's mirth in this pseudo-sublime. There's pleasure in something of the danger, the horror, the darkness, and the gloom over there on a screen, on canvas. And that pleasure, that delight, as Burke has, I think, has correctly diagnosed and detailed it, was already apparent to a small cadre of poets and writers and artists around the mid-17th century. But it would be Horace Walpole's 1764 Castle of Otranto that would actually actionize the Burkian sublime self-consciously into a literary form as Gothic and the Gothic horror we all know and love. But while the Burkian sublime is an essential element for the development of the Gothic and Gothic horror, a few other outstanding elements are incredibly important, essential as well. The first and foremost is the name for the aesthetic, the Gothic. With the rise of the 15th century humanists, the term Goth and Gothic, historically these were Germanic tribes which migrated west in the 4th and 5th centuries. They were refugees from the invasions of the Huns. The term Gothic became associated with the greatest of all nightmares in European history, the destruction of the Roman Empire. Thus, for the humanists of the 15th century, the Goths and Gothic were responsible for basically the destruction of civilization and were associated with all the horrible things with that. Barbarity, darkness, the Dark Ages, if you've heard of that, and violent decadence. So too, the arts, architecture, philosophy, religion, and even the magic prior to the 15th century were considered by the humanists to be terrible Gothic reminders of all that was lost in the fall of Rome. Thus, for a need for a rebirth, a renaissance of classical values, literature, Latin, architecture, religion, and yeah, even in magic. There was even a magical reform to reject the old Gothic grimoire demonic magic that they associated with blackness, darkness. And while that kind of denigration of the Goths might have been fine for the Italians, other emergent powers, especially the English, trace their descendants directly back not to the Romans, the Roman Britons, but precisely to those refugees, the immigrant Anglo-Saxons, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. And from Jordanes in the 6th century to Whig reformers in the 18th, the Goths were in much need of a makeover. They needed some good old-fashioned revisionism. Not destructive, but the vigorous Northern European answer to Mediterranean decadence. Not barbarian warlords, but egalitarian parliamentarians. Not the destroyers of civilization, but architects, from the megalithic Stonehenge to the vast cathedrals filled with divine light. Not uneducated brutes, but the ancient Druids were reimagined as philosophers and proto-scientists with the magic of their hieroglyphic runes. This trend, by the way, continues all the way down to today, with virile, tattooed, hunky Vikings made to be the corrective for the decadent Roman Christianity, which is all mostly free of any actual pesky history. But of course, the rehabilitation of the Goths was decidedly mixed. Woven into this narrative was that of the Anglo-Saxons immigrating and fighting for liberty. For liberty. This was a mythology that Thomas Jefferson would actually even adopt in his 1774 A Summary View of the Rights of British America, which actually became a sort of first draft for the Declaration of Independence. So this whole Gothic revisionism thing, it's kind of baked into this country as well. Especially, by the way, liberty against Roman tyranny in the form of the Catholic Church. Of course, against the Catholic Church. And thus, the Protestant Reformation was given a kind of Gothic sensibility. But not only that, the violent closure of the monasteries and the iconoclasm that took place primarily in Northern Europe, especially in England, were given a pride of place in this Gothic recuperation. It wasn't enough to shatter statues and smash stained glass and burn those churches for the radical iconoclasts. No, they left the ruins of popery and Roman superstition for all to marvel at in dread. Now, this all creates a kind of interesting historical paradox that to this day the UK is littered with the ironic remains of medieval Gothic architecture in magnificent ruins, destroyed precisely in the Gothic spirit of resisting the tyranny of the Roman Church. Of course, we shouldn't expect any of this mythological, revisionistic history to be rational or based on anything historical. In fact, as far as I can tell, it's mostly just vibes. But this reclamation and recuperation of all things Gothic, especially by the Whigs, as opposed to the austere neoclassicism of the aristocratic Tories, went more beyond paradoxical myth-making. Art filled with jaunts through ruined abbeys, gardens became filled with faux ruins called follies, and the neo-Gothic eventually became all the rage in English architecture. And as for Horace Walpole, he was an early adopter, maybe one of the earliest adopters of all things Gothic, but also of the particular delights in all things Burkian and Sublime, and he was also the first minister of the Whig Party, so he had a bunch of money to do all that. Indeed, after he purchased his home at Chopped Straw Hill and began to renovate it along what would now be recognized as something like Neo-Gothic style, he would rename it Strawberry Hill, along with additions of architectural elements that became known as the Gothic style. Really, Walpole innovated a lot of that stuff. He also packed his home with stained glass, pictures of saints, old suits of armor, antique swords and weapons, animal hides, and the like. With wallpaper he had made to look like bare stone walls, he even sought to make his home to be a kind of lived-in, living ruin, something between an ancient abbey, a cathedral, and a castle. That aesthetic, the aesthetic he sought to generate with all this old armor and Gothic flair, he termed Gloomth. Gloomth, a cross between gloomy and perhaps Gothic. Perhaps, no doubt, the precursor to what we now call the aesthetic of goth today. I don't know, it was like Joy Division, but with harpsichords. In Walpole, this Gothic palingenesis was met with the Burkian delight of the sublime, as wed, unsurprisingly, in a gloomy dream. That dream would become the nucleus of the Castle of Otranto, a Gothic story first published on Christmas Eve, 1764, as part of the English tradition of telling ghost stories that very night. And it was an instant hit, leaving readers astonished and getting an immediate second edition that following year. The Castle of Otranto began a literary tradition that exploded in the later 18th century, especially among women writers, and has continued unabated down to this day. Gothic horror had arrived. The novella takes the form of a pseudo-translation from a 13th century medieval telling of the tale, a conceit that Walpole would eventually abandon in the second edition. However, he makes his influences very clear. It is medieval romance, Shakespeare, and the Burkian Sublime. Oh yeah, I told you that Bill would make a reappearance. Bill Shakespeare, as I've mentioned before, developed the world of Hamlet, and Hamlet has gone down as something of the first instance of modern subjectivity, all broody and existential. But the world that Shakespeare created for the globe was just one chock full of murder and intrigue, Antiquity, ponderous graveyards barely lit by torches, ghosts, fairies, witches, sorcerers, love, and of course doom. Pounds and pounds of tragedy. Without any doubt, Shakespeare plays a strong hand in the development of what will become the Proto-Gothic, but it'd be Walpole's intentional deployment of the Burkian Sublime in a nearly textbook fashion, frankly, that would see the genre created in the Castle of Otranto. Now, I hate to disappoint you, but I'm not going to summarize it because you should go read it, and summaries on the internet just become an excuse not to read things, and we don't do that here. So read it. But to suffice to say, you get everything in this novella. You get phantasmagoria, dreamlike catastrophes. Yes, there is a giant helmet that falls from the sky, maybe even from the moon. Demented passion, secret passageways, a haunted castle replete with paintings that come to life and move around, demented love triangles and transgressive desires, all set within the constant gloom, sometimes pitch black darkness, raging storms, and melodrama as thick as it comes, all in the end of a titanic ruin to everything foretold in an ancient prophecy. The pacing is frantic. There's actually even an absence of quotation marks to intentionally drive on the sense of fury in the narrative. The fates of castles and kings are all at stake. The plot reverses in upon itself over and over like a good soap opera, and the claustrophobic castle, abbey, secret passageways, and crypts all become a vast character unto themselves. And atop all of that, virtually every horror movie trope is born in the Castle of Otranto, from the jump scare to sudden gusts of wind that blow out the one candle that she has in the darkness, the rampaging, demented father of the shining, the cries of nocturnal beasts, the dark and stormy night, the decrepit, ancient, haunted house, the near-ruined castle, lit only by torches and candles, the horrible secret, and of course, the doom that none can escape. It's all forged by Walpole in the Castle of Otranto. And it's not surprising that the book spawned an entire genre, an entire lifestyle, frankly, going into 10 further editions by the end of the 18th century. But is it worth reading? In his introduction to the Oxford World Classics edition, Nick Groom describes the book as striking modern readers as ludicrous and unreadable. And I've read a good many reviews online after I read it, and there's basically universal agreement that it's kind of hard to get through. And to be honest, I can't say that I found it terribly compelling as a read, though I'm also the kind of person that enjoys reading the Silmarillion, and I've repeatedly failed to read the entirety of The Lord of the Rings. I mean, I still get a 150-page in, and I'm like, why are they still walking around in the Shire, and who's Tom Bombadil? What? At any rate, I do think that any horror film, any goth, anyone interested in the occult, should give Burke's a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. You should give it a read for his analysis of the opposition of the beautiful and the sublime. Also, I should say that you philosophy folks, I see you back there, lurking in the back, Burke's empirical analysis of the sublime was on Kant's hit list, Kant the assassin, Kant's hit list in the Third Critique, so it's kind of necessary reading for y'all too, me too. Then, after you've read Burke, do your best to make it through the Castle of Otranto. It's not that long, all things told. It's 6 long chapters. And in fact, use Burke's list of the aspects of the sublime as like a bingo card. Or a drinking game to keep you going, to keep you reading it. And no, you should not do that. You will end up blackout drunk. That thing is too damn gothic. But there's something rewarding to get out the philosophical foundations of a genre, of an entire genre, the genre of Gothic horror that so many of us know and love, and experience the first expression of that genre, despite the fact that, might not have aged all that well. We're not all Black Sabbath in the end. And if nothing else, you can just go find in them the tools to up your Gloomth game. We all need to up our Gloomth game. So you can go full meta-goth with Burke and Walpole as your spiritual ancestors. More on the Gothic, more on the development of this kind of sense of horror at the level of philosophy itself. But I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica. where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.